The house sat quiet on a rural road outside Belleville, Ontario, the kind of place where neighbors know each other's cars and nothing much ever happens. But in the winter of 2010, an investigation would begin here that would end with the unmasking of one of the most decorated officers in the Canadian Forces, a man who had commanded an airbase, flown prime ministers and royalty, and, in secret, spent years terrorizing women in the dark. His name was Russell Williams. Born in England in 1963, Williams moved to Canada as a child and built a career that looked, on paper, like a model of discipline and achievement. He rose steadily through the Royal Canadian Air Force, earning a reputation as a skilled pilot and a capable leader. By 2009, he held one of the most prestigious postings in the country, Commander of Canadian Forces Base Trenton, the busiest airbase in Canada, responsible for search and rescue operations and military transport across the country. He was trusted, respected, and, to those who knew him, unremarkable in the most reassuring sense of the word. But beginning in 2007, a very different pattern had started to emerge in the towns surrounding his postings. It began with break-ins. In Tweed and Orleans, Ontario, women reported that intruders had entered their homes while they were away, taking nothing of obvious value, no cash, no electronics. Instead, the thief stole underwear and lingerie, sometimes photographing the empty homes before leaving. Investigators treated the reports as a nuisance at first, a fetish burglar with no history of violence. Over more than 80 break-ins across several years, the pattern held. No confrontation, no injury, just an unsettling, invisible presence moving through people's private spaces. Then, in September 2009, the pattern turned violent. A woman in Tweed was assaulted in her own bedroom by a masked intruder who bound and photographed her before fleeing. Weeks later, a second woman was attacked in a similar manner in Brighton, Ontario. Both survived, but the details of the attacks, the careful staging, the photography, the meticulous planning, suggested the same person was behind both the burglaries and the assaults. Investigators still had no name, no face, nothing but a growing case file and a rising sense of dread. That dread became reality on November 25, 2009. Marie-France Como, a 37-year-old corporal in the Canadian Forces stationed at CFB Trenton, was found dead in her home in Brighton. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Como worked at the same base commanded by Russell Williams, a detail that, at the time, meant nothing to investigators. There was no obvious suspect, no clear motive, and a community already unsettled by months of break-ins now faced something far darker. Just over 2 months later, on January 28, 2010, 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd vanished from her home near Belleville. She had spoken to her mother that evening and simply never made contact again. Her disappearance triggered one of the largest search efforts in the region's history, involving hundreds of volunteers, police officers, and military personnel combing the snow-covered countryside. It was this case that would finally break the pattern open. Investigators, led by the Ontario Provincial Police, began working the disappearance with unusual intensity, cross-referencing tips, security footage, and vehicle sightings near Lloyd's home. One detail stood out: tire tracks in the snow near her house, left by a distinctive set of tires. Officers began systematically checking vehicles in the area that matched the tread pattern, a slow and painstaking process that eventually led them to a black Nissan Pathfinder registered to Colonel Russell Williams. On February 7, 2010, Williams was brought in for what began as a routine interview. Detective Sergeant Jim Smith of the Ontario Provincial Police sat across from him for hours, laying out the evidence piece by piece: the tire tracks, the timeline, the base assignments linking him to both victims. For most of the interview, Williams remained composed, offering little. But as the evidence mounted and the silence stretched on, something in him shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he began to talk. Over the following hours, Williams confessed. He told investigators where to find Jessica Lloyd's body, dumped near a rural culvert not far from her home. He admitted to the murders of both Como and Lloyd, to the sexual assaults in Tweed and Brighton, and to the string of fetish burglaries stretching back years. Search teams later recovered an enormous archive of photographs and videos he had taken of his victims and of the break-ins themselves.
a meticulous, self-documented record of the crimes, kept hidden in his own home. The news that followed stunned the country. A colonel in the Canadian forces, a man who had flown Queen Elizabeth II and senior government officials, who commanded the nation's busiest airbase, was revealed to be a serial predator who had operated undetected for years while rising through the ranks of the military he served.
Russell Williams was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and dozens of counts related to the break-ins. He pleaded guilty to all charges in October 2010, sparing the families a trial, but requiring the court to hear, in exhaustive and disturbing detail, the full scope of what he had done. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. He was also stripped of his rank and military honors, a formal and symbolic end to the career that had given him access, authority, and ultimately, cover. What made the case so difficult for the public to process wasn't just the violence, it was the disguise. Williams did not fit any profile people expected. He was not isolated or erratic. He was married, successful, admired by colleagues, entrusted with responsibilities most people will never hold. For years, he lived 2 entirely separate lives, one in plain sight and one hidden in the dark, and no one around him saw the second. Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd are remembered by their families and communities not for how they died, but for who they were before a stranger in a position of trust ended their lives. Their deaths led directly to the end of Williams's crimes, closing a case that had quietly terrorized rural Ontario for years without a name or a face attached to it. Russell Williams remains in prison today, one of the most notorious criminals in Canadian history, proof that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones no one thinks to suspect.